I'm just going to make a few points. They seem probably quite obvious, hopefully not too much. Because I'm going quite fast, I'm speaking in really terrible generalizations, and please feel free to challenge me on them. So my first point is really very similar to Ian's first point, that there's a kind of sense of interest in what's going on, but it's not the motivating dynamic, it's not the centre of attention in terms of political life in Northern Ireland. Probably a slightly different point is there's also possibly a form of self-censorship going on both Unionist and Nationalist sides in Northern Ireland, because Republicans and Nationalists would see this as the end of the Union, would therefore in some sense want it to come about, but know that it's very, very unhelpful to it coming about to say that, publicly. And secondly, Unionists are, there's a very complicated situation of different Unionist groups trying to outbid each other in to get the Unionist vote. And so it's in some senses unhelpful for Unionists in terms of those internal Unionist dynamics to really raise fears about the end of the Union. Secondly, the second point really leads on to my next slide, that it's also quite complicated when we dig down a bit beneath who might support and discuss and be interested in the referendum to see how Scotland translates across. It translates in complicated ways. I generally think that's a good thing in Northern Ireland. Very crudely, Protestant unionism and loyalism. This population most identifies as Scottish identity culturally and with religious overtones. You're taught Scottish dancing in schools. Ulster Scots has been, and this has been a thing that has very much risen during the period post-agreement, partly in reaction to cultural rights given in the agreement to Irish language and Irish culture. Secondly, Scottish nationalism, in some senses, is more associated historically with Scottish Protestant population than Catholic. So there's a funny possibility of a sneaking regard from Northern Irish unionism to Scottish nationalism. There's elements of unionism historically that are a little bit SNP-esque, probably SNP in earlier incarnations. I suppose notions of perfidious Albinism, although Catholics see the Union as really supporting Unionists. Unionists are a little bit like Israelis are with America. What everybody else sees as support, they don't see as supportive, and they're very, very distrusting. And Northern Irish Unionists, the point is also that despite these affinities, almost with Scottish nationalism, of course they're Unionist, and therefore that trumps everything else in terms of the position on the referendum. Catholic nationalism and Republicanism. Oh, I should have had brackets around the Catholic. You never see these mistakes till you go through. Well, arguably a little put on the spot by the referendum, because of course it could trigger questions about the push for a referendum in Northern Ireland, which, unlike the Scotland Act, there is provision for a referendum already in the equivalent Northern Ireland Act. However, they're seeking Irish unity and not independence. And to some extent, the big game in particular of Republicanism, which is by far the biggest bloc than SDLP nationalism, is that their big game has really to become the major electoral force in the south. And that's the post-agreement strategy very clearly. And a vote for unity requires consent and the constituency to build in the south. But interestingly, that strategy in the south, and it's involved Gerry Adams giving up his seats in the north and going to the south, they win votes not by espousing Irish unity, but they win votes in the south by being an alternative, radical, progressive voice. Or, I mean, this is whether they are or not, it's a different issue. And being a sort of dissenter voice to notions of political establishment, particularly in austerity. And in some senses, making a claim for a referendum potentially disrupts that strategy and brings it on too soon. Also, there's a limiting by the fact that the referendum provisions are set out in both the agreement and the Northern Ireland Act. I'm going to come to that in my next slide. And there may be implicit further veto limitations. So you could argue that the logic of the agreement, if not the letter of the agreement, is that there would need to be a consent of Unionists in the north and not just a majority as in 50.1 of the north. And that's a debate that I think would come to the fore were a referendum imminent. There has been some legal protection from referendum game playing, so there is clear provision in the Northern Ireland Act It says that should the Secretary, essentially all of this means, should the Secretary of State decide that a majority would be in favour of it, he can at any time call a poll, call a referendum in Northern Ireland, with the proviso that there can't be more than one every 7 years. So people that are looking for post-referendum reform in Northern Ireland, there's a time limit there. The proposals, the question, the form of the question has to be agreed and has to be laid before Parliament. I suppose that has meant that the types of debates that triggered who could call a referendum and people just willy-nilly calling for referendum are a bit limited because they've already pre-signed up to this in the agreement. The $6 million question, I suppose, is what about the Troubles? Peace process is sort of in trouble at the minute, but isn't it always? There's a sense of, we stared into the abyss that many times. We all got quite fed up staring into the abyss, but these were actually real abysses. It seems to be in a little more trouble recently. So the point at which the talks failed last January, I mean, Richard Haas actually gave evidence to the American Congress. He's somebody I would take seriously, saying there is a real danger of sliding back. I find very different constituencies tell me very different things about how much it's in trouble, but it's in a period of disquiet at the minute, which is definitely putting the Assembly in jeopardy, I think. But that trouble is unrelated to Scotland. It's due to the unfinished business, things that weren't adequately dealt with around prisoners, victims, dealing with the past, the big one, and also, I suppose, about whether people were going to cross the Rubicon in terms of power sharing. Also, there are outbidders in the conflict resolution dialogue on each side. So in other words, groups who take more radical positions than both the mainstream Unionists and Republicans in an attempt to outbid them and gain votes. And Northern Ireland politics is very vulnerable to those outbidders. And interestingly then, something like welfare reform those positions force the moderates or people who've moved to a moderate position to retrench a little bit. Welfare reforms have brought this to the fore. In that, if you just imagine, everyone knows there's power sharing, but just imagine for a minute that instead of the coalition in London between the Conservatives and the Lib Dem, where they work out a programme of government and agree to go into power, you had a coalition between pre-New Labour Party, and UKIP. Right, then you've got the Northern Ireland power sharing arrangement. And it wasn't a voluntary coalition where they'd agreed the terms, it was an enforced coalition. Then fling into them a mandate to introduce the bedroom tax or pay for these things yourselves, and we'll cut it from your welfare provision. And what you see is a huge potential for destabilisation. And that is probably the trigger that's most dangerous at the minute, in that there's been a refusal to agree around welfare reform. That's hitting the rest of the budget. And now everybody, each ministry is owned by a different party, so everyone can play games on that. That's relevant to the Scottish debate. Will indyref destabilise? I just put out two pessimistic scenarios, one for yes and one for no, and two optimistic scenarios. Yes, a yes vote could pessimistically give Unionists an existential crisis greater than what has been a long existential crisis. And it could trigger nationalist calls, momentum for a referendum. I suppose the $6 million question is, what's the connection between that and military activity? Because neither mainstream Unionists, Nationalists or Republicans will themselves engage in military activity around that. So the question is, how would that connect to military activity by others? No, the pessimistic scenario is a far-out possibility that reinforced Unionist UK rhetoric exacerbates militant Republicanism. I myself think that's a pretty far-out possibility, but there are pockets of militant and military republicanism still lively. Or that, more likely, a reconfigured UK could accidentally damage the agreement. So, for example, the whole Bill of Rights debate had very negative consequences for Northern Ireland. Finally, will indyref destabilise? The optimistic scenario and pessimistic on a no vote. Oh no, I've got these the wrong way around. Well, I'll leave you to figure it out. But the optimistic scenario for a yes vote is that Northern Ireland would carve a better deal for its... no, that should be... Right, okay, sorry. That should really be a no vote, right? A yes vote. So that was the pessimistic scenario on a yes vote, and this is the pessimistic scenario on a no vote, I think. Northern Ireland carves... You know, it's an interactive presentation. We have to sort out its problems. Northern Ireland could carve a better deal for itself post a no vote within the UK. It could be more loved. Scotland's gone. We better love Northern Ireland. Difficult, maybe. Reassuring Unionists, while Nationalists can see that democratic politics works, you get a referendum, you win it, you go. That really undermines militant republicanism. No vote, well, it's possible that this again benefits Northern Ireland and is a stabilising. So there could be a reconfiguring of the UK, which operates, as did devolution, as a space within which to agree difficult issues. So the devolution debate coincided with the peace process. This enabled Republicans to present it as a process that was like South Africa, and Unionists to say, look, it's just modernisation like everyone else is doing. And that was actually hugely helpful to reaching agreement on difficult issues. That's it, thanks.